Hi, welcome to Common Sense. I'm Ed.
And I'm John.
Hey,
Welcome.
John.
So in 1776, we were far from being a United States of America. And really, if anything, we were more like a loose group of colonies competing with each other, sometimes fighting with each other. Each of us, each colony, which then became a state, had its own unique history, its own culture, and a lot of them had their own government, even though they still answered to the British government. So, Common Sense was Thomas Paine's pamphlet that he wrote to try to encourage colonists to break away from Britain and form their own country, to unite together in a common cause, a common government, a common nation. And of course, that was never going to be easy, and it still hasn't been. There's still many divisions, even today, that we see. So, what are some of those divisions that you see that get in the way of successful business today, Ed?
So we're not talking about the divisions of the country. We're talking about when we get down into the sales and marketing team, the revenue growth continuum, if you will,
Sure.
customer service. What are those divisions? Well, certainly one of the biggest, and we've talked about this in some of our previous conversations, is that the roles and responsibilities have changed. But in many cases, the descriptions and the perception of those roles hasn't. So buyers, by changing their behaviors, are changing the kinds of things that marketers and sellers and customer service teams need to be doing. But those marketers, sellers, and customer service teams are still doing the old things that they always have in most cases. Sometimes there's little tweaks, but the kind of wholesale shift that needs to happen hasn't. And so that creates divisions and friction within the organizations and between the organizations and the buyers. There's kind of these two parts of the friction. It's easy to say that this is a CEO responsibility, and that's something that I believe very strongly because it's a cultural issue, it's an organizational chart issue, it's a resource allocation issue, and fundamentally it's a philosophical issue for the company. But just like sometimes the marketers, sellers, and customer service don't see how that role's changed, in some cases the CEOs don't either. You can view this or kind of see this in action from a number of different angles. Even just ask within a company, what constitutes a prospect? What constitutes a lead? When is a prospect or a lead appropriate to hand off to the sales team? What's the customer service responsibility to keep sales informed in the ongoing? Those very simple kinds of things that you would assume everyone just has a common definition or a common understanding of, in many cases are not so common. You start to say, well, how can we measure success or how can we measure progress? What's appropriate as a way to make sure that we're making some progress in this? I would say that one of the biggest barriers, going back to one of our earlier conversations, is a common database, using CRM, so that everybody in the company has vision into what that buyer or prospect or customer, what their interaction is like with the company, and has the insights of the digital body language and all the other pieces that fit into that. The question of whether marketing is creating the right sales enablement content for the sales team. There's always going to be friction between the roles because the roles have different responsibilities. But the basic functional pieces, like are we supporting each other the way we need to, are I think where you see some of these divisions that exist. I guess if these jobs aren't being done though, or if there's some dysfunction in the way they're being done, the question is not just are they failing, we're saying they are, but where are they failing, and how can you begin to troubleshoot that?
Yeah, it's a tough problem, just like Thomas Paine was facing so many years ago, because it's rooted in history. Companies have been doing things this way for centuries, and it's always been a different department between sales, marketing communications, customer service, and they all had their own leadership. They all had their own way of hiring people. And oftentimes when you'd put them in a room to discuss results, they'd be pointing the fingers at each other rather than trying to understand what the ultimate solution might be. So fast forward to today, and according to Marketing Profs, 90% of companies say that their sales and marketing teams are not aligned. And so that's a pretty disturbing statistic right there. That means there really isn't even much effort going on in terms of understanding each other's needs and processes and getting things more efficient, more pointed in the same direction. And ultimately, the same data shows that disconnect is, 40% of companies report that they are unable to or having trouble closing sales deals because of that disconnect, that misalignment between sales and marketing. And you really should include customer service in here too, because if you think about it, sales goes beyond that first sale. It goes towards repeat sales and churn and retention and all those things. And if all those departments aren't talking together, you're going to have that same problem ultimately. So there's some really tough questions that need to be answered by the CEO, by the executive team, by the leaders of these older silos. And some radical action in some cases needs to be taken to reorganize, to rethink the whole process. And that really starts with the CEO. So it's going to take some kind of commitment, certainly to start with, to get started with this process of aligning these departments. And that, ultimately means a lot of change. So how would a CEO or maybe a board talk about how the impact of this might affect revenue generation and profitability?
Well, there's soft and there's hard numbers, if you will. There's kind of the art and the science to it. From a hard numbers perspective or the science, according to Serious Decisions, B2B firms with a tightly aligned sales and marketing function experience 24% faster 3-year revenue growth and 27% faster 3-year profit growth. But that doesn't just happen, obviously. The point of what you are articulating is that the reason that dysfunction exists in many cases is that the silos can't solve it within the silos. The essence of this problem is that it has to happen at the intersection of the silos. And so when you can make those changes at the intersection, or essentially eliminate the silos and have this continuum of skills and customer focus, you can get to that highly aligned point. And highly aligned organizations achieve, according to Aberdeen Group, an average of 32% year-over-year revenue growth, while less aligned companies actually saw a 7% decrease. So if you want to talk about it just in terms of the numbers, if you're aligned, you grow, and profits grow even faster statistically. And if you're not aligned, well, not only are you standing still, but in many cases, you're actually going to see a decrease in revenue. For other organizations that are tightly aligned, where that marketing and sales function, and obviously we've talked about how this extends earlier to PR and later to customer service, et cetera. But for the sake of the discussion, a lot of times people talk about it just in the context of that sales and marketing group. So in the context of the sales and marketing group, tightly aligned functions in companies find 36% higher customer retention rates and 38% higher sales win rates. Those numbers according to Marketing Prof. Now, it's not land of milk and honey. I mean, there's always going to be friction. People responsible for demand gen look at the world differently than people responsible for lead gen. They look at the world differently than people responsible for closing business and people responsible for cleaning up the messes of what sales committed to that they can't quite do and take care of in the back end. And I mean, everyone's got different perspectives. And so there's going to be friction. The point is, what you do is if you solve it from the customer perspective, then you've got an issue of helping people work together toward optimizing the buyer experience rather than protecting the fiefdoms of their silos and budgets and headcount and everything that goes along with that. So speaking of that, getting into the organizational change of it, what organizational changes have you seen that you think can lead to better alignment between the sales and marketing function?
Well, again, it could be a radical change. It could be something as dramatic as breaking those barriers completely and creating a hybrid organization that's really a customer oriented group that does sales, marketing, and customer service, and even PR, like you said. Everybody that's sort of outward facing has to be on the same page, and really they need to be communicating with everyone else. So it doesn't do any good for marketing to be working on its own without information from the product group or from the research and development group. And similarly with sales, sales needs to communicate with those same groups and with shipping, distribution, channel. I mean, all these groups within the organization need to be communicating much faster now and much more effectively and sharing the same information. And it's really for one major reason, and that is that everything is digital now. Everything is happening in fractions of a second. You don't have days to, understand what a customer is asking for and to get back to them. It doesn't work that way anymore. You're going to lose sales by doing that. So everybody needs to be taking advantage of data sharing and technology. They need to be, they need to have an aligned process so everyone knows exactly how to respond in any given situation. You have all these channels out there, these internet channels, for example. You have the website, you have social media, you have chatbots and AI and social media and everything you can think of in between that are possible touch points for customers. So all of these things need to be coordinated. You have to be able to route information to the right person at exactly the right time within the organization, and also have the appropriate response for every question, every inquiry that comes from a customer. So that's a big change. It's not something any one department can handle, as you said, and it really requires a coordination of effort. In many cases, it really requires people doing multiple jobs at the same time, understanding how to do both sales and marketing, for example, and being able to assist with both. So you need some sort of hybrid employees as well. So there's a lot of challenges on the technical side, but certainly the most important is on the human resources side, I think, and getting the right people in the right seats. So what are your thoughts on that, and how does this impact the future of hiring?
So I think the really simple answer was, so this fits in that category of simple but not easy. The simple answer is to solve for the buyer. And that means not somebody that's got a marketing degree that thinks just in terms of email subject lines, but somebody that thinks of a buyer in the continuum of experience when they first have the hint of an opportunity or a problem, aren't even sure what it is or how to define it, much less how to solve it or what vendor they want to go to, but just begin thinking about it and searching and not even quite sure what to ask or what to look for. And from that point, through the point that they're getting ready to sign a contract, or more importantly, kind of buy again or sign a renewal or whatever's later on that contributes to that lifetime value, what is important to them? It's not the role or title or department of the person they're talking to. It's the competence and business understanding and ability to help them achieve their objectives. So that really becomes the solve, I think, when you're hiring people, regardless of where in that continuum of skills, from PR through marketing, through inside sales and field sales and technical support and customer service, et cetera. It's the really understanding empathetically the buyer. And a lot of that it's a function of actually business experience, not even so much some sort of domain or particular professional experience. Organizational structure can help drive a lot of that. Silos, we've talked about how silos actually kind of work against it or create a challenge. The inverse can also be true. If you structure the organization using maybe work cells, something like an agile cell that bridges those functions and allows people that have very facile communication, both in terms of physical proximity and digital tools, and are accustomed to how each other works and the tempo of working together a lot, that can certainly facilitate that communication. And part of hiring is people have to be comfortable in that kind of environment, having those skills. There's a Deloitte survey that talks about shifting away from hierarchical organizational structures toward models where work is accomplished in teams. And in fact, they've got some data that says only 14% of executives believe that the traditional organizational model with its embedded hierarchical job levels based on experience in specific areas, et cetera, makes for a more flexible, makes for an effective organization. And instead, what their Deloitte finds is more effective and is encouraging executives to do is look for flexible, team-centric models. So,
but don't you think we have to reevaluate job descriptions as well? I mean, a marketer becomes someone who's really more like a customer success representative rather than someone whose job is to push out a certain amount of content or, generate a certain number of leads. That's really not what it's about anymore. It's about finding the right customers, getting their respect and trust and hanging on to them. And it's everybody's job to do that now. It's not just customer service. It's not sales. Everybody who engages in any way with a customer needs to have that mindset.
So wave your magic wand. The perfect employee then is going to be somebody, regardless of what their title is, that can look in the CRM, see the digital body language and actual interactions with a prospect or customer, and know who in the organization ought to be in touch with them at what point and how that interaction ought to go. Whether it's an email from the president or a phone call from the sales rep or an email with an additional brochure from the marketing team. I mean, the right people are going to intuit that kind of interaction, and that customer solving for the customer really ought to be the key in hiring the employees in my experience.
Yeah, it needs to be part of your culture code. It needs to be something that's enforced as well. You can't just sort of hope it happens.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. And you can structure in different ways. You can structure by vertical industry they're selling to, or geographic area, or kind of type of customer. Maybe some are B2B and some are B2C, and you solve for it very differently in those kinds of situations. But envisioning and building is different than knowing is it working. And so that means measuring. And so I guess my next question for you is, how do you measure? How do you actually hold these functions accountable? How do you know if you're making progress against these challenges?
Well, it's going to depend on your organization, of course, and your customers, and your culture to some extent. But really, the thing that's working the best is to create a service level agreement among all the stakeholders. So not necessarily just the departments, but really everyone who participates in any of these disciplines, especially their leadership, needs to have an agreement, a contract, literally, among them that says, we're going to be completely transparent in what we do, and we're going to work towards X goals in this quarter, and we're going to measure them this way, and we're going to show you the results of those in a very open way using our technology, so that everybody's on board with how progress is going at any time. And then you have regular discussions or meetings to review progress, identify trouble spots, and come up with solutions. It's kind of a basic thing, but that's not something that most departments or silos have done in the past. So it starts with that internal contract, and then you'd identify things that are meaningful to measure. So not necessarily just revenue or number of customers or repeat customers. It'd be more like ratings or reviews from customers. How are we doing in this customer journey? How are our customers viewing our, not just our brand, but how we present ourselves and how we assist them in their journey? So that could be surveys, that could be rating systems, review systems. And then you'd want some more detailed statistics about, the buyer journey, attracting the right kinds of leads from the right, and that would be something you'd have to agree upon as well. What is a qualified sales lead? And then you'd measure them based on the criteria that everyone agreed to in this service level agreement. So you'd measure that, and you'd measure the speed of response and the number of emails that go out to requests, and in what time frame. How many meetings have been generated to help out? So there's some volumetric statistics like close rates and upsells and so on, but you'd really want to feature those things that really matter to customers. So what are some examples of this whole process? Putting it together, doing the right hiring, reorganizing the structure, putting these sales or the SLAs in place. Are there some examples that we could cite that are good examples, or are we still kind of in the early stages of this process?
So in the industrial manufacturing space, I think it's still relatively early. If you look at some industries like the SaaS space, it's more advanced. People have been thinking this way for a while. Particularly in the SaaS world, you've got basically leads and customers, and so there's a very strong focus in those areas. And how do you optimize around it? There was a really interesting article in Harvard Business Review a couple months ago that talked about why CMOs are failing. And if you kind of read between the lines, it talked about how there's three kinds of CMOs. There's a commercialization CMO, there's a strategy CMO, and then there's a P&L CMO. The P&L being kind of like the Uber level, which is a combination of both. The point that the article made was that in order for the CMO to survive, the function has to work. In order for the function to work, they have to think as part of the business. So the research and the early examples show that where the marketing function fits well as part of the business in a collaborative way, not just as a silo way, it works. I mean, McKinsey, for instance, shows that companies that have more advanced marketing and sales capabilities tended to be 30% greater than 30% more effective, I guess, than companies of a similar size in their sector, same kind of industry, without the same sort of alignment. So if an industry is growing at a 4% rate and your company can be 30% more effective, that puts you at, what is that, 5.5% or something like that. Doesn't sound like a huge bit, but you start compounding that annually, and before you know it, it makes a big difference. Marketing has to own the responsibility, really. That's what it comes down to. And in companies where that's happening, where the CEO is dictating that sort of collaboration among the departments with a continuum, a chief revenue officer in many cases, continuum of that function, that's where it's working. But if we know there's compelling reasons to change, and you got to get out of the silos, you got to try to integrate those functions, you have to align them, where do you start? We've talked about how it's CEO responsibility, but if you really want to try to implement something like this at a company, where do you start? How do you do it?
Well, I think the best place to start is the sales and marketing part of it. And really that's about sitting down in a room and getting the key stakeholders together, the people who understand and maybe dictate the rules within their departments, and get them together and understand what needs to happen in order to have a better result or better outcome for the customer. So it involves evaluating and realigning your sales and marketing process. So some simple things could be agreeing on what that qualified sales lead really looks like. What are the criteria we're exactly looking for? And how could we use marketing to attract those people instead of just the world? And then, just sort of the timeline. What happens next? Once someone knocks on the door, who gets the call? How do we hand that off to the appropriate person? Who are the right people to answer those types of questions? And then how do we get to them? So how do we flow the information from the chatbot or from the website to the right person and get the information they need in seconds instead of days? And then things like what happens next? So who responds after that initial sales lead, inquiry, or maybe it's a phone call, or maybe it's a meeting. But what are those processes that need to happen, and what support do they need from marketing to get to do the most effective job they can? What kinds of content do they need? Where do they find it? How is it organized? And then you need to agree on how your analytics, your data collection and analytics align with your goals. So sales and marketing might have different goals. Sales, for example, is really more interested in how many deals are closed and for what revenue. And marketing might be more interested in lead generation. So you need to put those things together and have them agree on those thresholds and goals. So just starting there, you can imagine you're going to start seeing some quick wins. You're going to start seeing some efficiencies. And if you're getting everyone on board in the same system, using the same CRM system, for example, you can really start to track the progress towards achieving those goals. And those quick wins are going to help build momentum towards the rest of the change we've talked about, which is getting everybody in the organization on the same page. So we're going to talk in a lot more detail about that in our next session. And I hope you'll join us then.
So sounds like we're within reach of the point where those cartoons that we all know about marketing saying we don't get enough leads and they're all junk, and or marketing saying sales never follows up on our leads, and sales saying we don't get enough leads and they're all junk. It sounds like maybe we can actually move past that in a more functional, better aligned sales and marketing world.
I think so, yeah.
Cool. Well, looking forward to our next conversation about the sales process. And until then, thanks for joining us for Common Sense. I'm Ed.
And I'm John.